works with the camera center and the street. I think a little more light would actually be good.
Hi everyone, welcome to Darwin Week. It's the first talk of the whole week, first talk of the day, so forgive us for being a little bit late on the technology, just figuring everything out. Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. John Fritsch. He will be presenting a healthy dose of skepticism. Dr. John Fritsch is an Associate Dean in the College of Humanities, Arts and Sciences and a professor in the Department of Communication Studies. Dr. Fritsch served as the head of Communication Studies for 8 years before entering the Dean's office. He is also the director of the National Debate Training, or was. Dr. Fritsch's teaching and research interests are in the areas of argumentation and the place of argumentation in civic engagement and decision making. Dr. Fritsch received his BA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and his MA and PhD from the University of Kansas. He teaches courses in rhetorical theory, language and communication, and ethics. Please welcome Dr. John Fritsch.
Projector is not working this afternoon, so don't worry about that. First of all, thank you for showing up today. Thank you to Unify, especially Abby Shue, who said to me one afternoon, Dr. Fritsch, would you be interested in speaking at Darwin Week? And I was a bit puzzled, as my background is in communication studies and argumentation. I thought, well, sure, but what about? And she said, we'd like you to talk about skepticism. I said, okay. Without thinking too much more about it. Because first of all, one reason is I'm really honored to be speaking at an event like this. I think Darwin Week encapsulates much of what I think the university should be about, what college life should be about. I really applaud the undergraduates who are involved in organizations like Unify, who get people together to think about things outside of the classroom. That should be an important part of college life, but really life beyond college as well. One of the things I often tell people is, some of my friends will say, you're a professor, what do you do? What's your job? I often say to them, my job is to think. Have you ever tried to stop thinking? They say, I can't. I said, you're right, I'm on the clock 24 hours a day. I'm overworked. But that should be a part of what we do, and that's one of the things I want to talk to you about today. Now, I may not be able to live up to the ideal of causing you to think, but at 3 p.m., Dr. Kim Macklin will be here, and she certainly will be able to do that, so I'd encourage you to stick around for her presentation immediately after this. What I want to talk to you a little bit about today is the topic that I chose for today's talk is a healthy dose of skepticism. And what I want to do is I want to start out by just asking a question. You can feel free to join in at any point in time. What is a dose? I'm going to break this down a little bit. What's a dose? Is it? Size, right? When somebody says you need a dose of medicine, there is usually a notion that there is an appropriate amount as part of it, but what does the dose do for you? What's the intent of taking a dose?
Sufficient so that you don't overdose on something. You have the appropriate amount of whatever the substance is.
Right. So the appropriate amount. The appropriate amount might be, if you're taking a dose, I've got a cold. So last night I took a dose of cold medicine. I read carefully the package. Take 1 or 2 pills every 4 to 6 hours, no more than 6 times during a day. All right. Well, I don't take that much medicine, but every time I read it, the notion is that the dose, though, what it's supposed to do is make me feel better. All right. So the first thing is the dose is supposed to be good for us. All right. The second part is I've been fascinated by this phrase since I was really little. A healthy dose. What is a healthy dose? The reason I'm fascinated by this is one time when I was little, I was staying with Grandpa and Grandma and I had a cough. And Grandma says, you need to stop coughing. She's worried. She's Grandma. She looks at me and says, you need a healthy dose of whiskey. Grandma's cough medicine. All right? And what she did was she took some whiskey and some honey and mixed it together. I guess the honey was supposed to be the healthy part. And gave it to me. I was little enough to know that I should not be drinking whiskey, like 4 or 5, and really concerned when she kept saying it's a healthy dose. By healthy, she meant a good amount, right? And a good amount of whiskey when you're 4 or 5 is enough to make you quit coughing and not enough to make you drunk, right? Which is probably a couple of teaspoons is all, right? I was really little. So there's the notion of the healthy dose. It's quite a bit, right? Take a healthy dose of, we'll use this in my house sometimes. I'll look at my wife and say, well, you need to take a healthy dose of whatever is ailing her, whatever would fix the ailment, all right? But the flip side of that is if we say that there's a healthy dose, we also must know that there's something called an unhealthy dose, right? Otherwise, we just call it a dose every time, right? Just take a dose of medicine, take a dose of whiskey, and you'll be better. I feel like I should be in Tombstone when I say that, right? So what would make an unhealthy dose? Too much or too little, right? And we know that that can happen. Somebody even mentioned it already. When we talk about doses, we want to be careful so that we do not overdose. We can take too much of a medicine. We can take too much of many things. And the overdose that I want to talk about for a little bit today is the unhealthy dose of skepticism. All right? Now, at first I thought I'd come up with a clever thing, and then I Googled it and discovered that it's not so clever. In fact, unhealthy dose of skepticism is used many times. An unhealthy dose of skepticism is used to discuss everything from 9/11 theories to views of school lunches to vaccinations for young people, to global warming, to John F. Kennedy assassination theories, to investing with Jim Cramer, the guy on Mad Money on CNN or CNBC. All right? So all of these things, people understand that we should look at with quite a bit of skepticism, but some people take it too far. All right? If that's the case, the first thing we need to do is talk a little bit about what skepticism is. Skepticism is a theory of epistemology. It dates back to at least the time of David Hume, all right, who many people say drew a lot of his thinking out of Rene Descartes. And Hume's notion is that many things which we believe to be true cannot be proven. There's a distinction between things we believe and things which actually exist. All right? And so for Hume, the question is an epistemological one. When can we say that we know something? All right? I'm uninterested in that question, to be quite honest. Okay? I find that to be not very, I remember the first time I took a philosophy class, my father-in-law said to me, I was married while I was an undergraduate. I came home for the weekend. What are you taking this semester? I went through the list of classes, and I said, in a philosophy class. And he says, oh, that's where you lay a spoon on the table and try to decide what's really there, right? And I said, well, no, that's not really what this philosophy class is. But he had understood a little bit about the epistemological nature of parts of philosophy. I'm not really interested in that question. All right? And I'll take you to where I am interested by the time we are done today. So, we've been thinking about this question of how do we deal with making decisions in our culture. One of the things that I think has happened in our own time is that we are actually, I think we're at a really unique time in human history. And the reason is a bizarre one. We have too much information. When I went to college even, Clint Reed over here is a librarian. I think he'll relate to this very easily. When I went to college, we spent a lot of time in the library. When we go, what's your speech topic going to be? What's your paper topic going to be? The first thing we had to do was go find some sources. And now, when I go to a student, do you have any sources? They're like, well, I just Googled it. I can look it up, and instead of not having enough sources, we have too many sources much of the time, which leads us to a very different type of skepticism. Rather than how do I know, the thing that I'll often hear people say is something along the lines of, well, we'll just have to agree to disagree, assuming that every opinion is of equal value. And I don't think we want to go down this path, okay? And so I've been thinking about how do we get out of this notion that everybody's ideas are essentially the same, that it's all fair game. You think one thing, I think the opposite. Whatever, right? I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, you say Democrats are better for the economy, I say Republicans are better for the economy, you lay out a couple statistics, I lay out a couple statistics, whatever. We'll just have to agree to disagree. No, we should not be in that situation. We should be making good, sound choices, all right? So how do we make those choices? I read a book recently by Nate Silver called, Nate Silver is a really interesting individual, I think. He wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise. If you're familiar with Nate Silver, it's probably because he has a website called 538 that predicts elections, especially presidential elections, and he's really good at it, right? Before he did that, he was an internet gambler. Made some pretty good money gambling on the internet. And if you think about how gambling works, it's a really fascinating thing because it's about making wise decisions. If you're a good gambler, you start to learn to read what other people are doing, and you start to be able to anticipate and make predictions about the value of the cards that you have in your hand. And before that, he created one of the best systems in baseball for predicting the future value of baseball players. It was widely studied, widely adopted by people. The PECOTA system, P-E-C-O-T-A, which is a long acronym, but it's really written PECOTA because Nate Silver was a Cleveland Indians fan, and Billy PECOTA played for my Kansas City Royals, and the only people he could ever hit well against was the Cleveland Indians. And so this guy was kind of a thorn in Nate Silver's side. So Silver sits down and tries to say, how is it that we can make better predictions, better decisions? And the way he goes about this is really interesting. He does a bunch of case studies, but in the chapter on global warming, he talks about 3 types of skeptics. So there's 3 types of skeptics I want to talk about briefly, and talk about why each of these are the first people. And we all know people like this. You say, well, you know, whatever is said, they're likely to disagree. Part of Silver's argument is that the contrarian may almost be uniquely an American kind of individual. That most cultures do not have people who just disagree to disagree, but we have kind of privileged that, valorized it within our culture as being something which is really important. Now the problem is, with each type of skeptic, if there's an unhealthy dose of too much, there's also the lack of enough dose, all right? And the opposite of a contrarian is someone who agrees with everything, right? I had a student one time, I used to be the debate coach at Missouri State University, and we were driving to a debate tournament. We were talking about conspiracy theories, and one kid goes, I love conspiracy theories, I believe them all. Just, my head exploded, right? They had to clean it up off the van, I know, because I was like, so you believe that John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald and the CIA and the hobo? I was like, yeah. It's like, it doesn't get better than this. The mafia probably had something to do with it too, didn't they? Yeah. But what he meant, I think, was that for him, it was kind of an interesting thing to read what other people said. The Flat Earth Society, the people who say that the Apollo never made it to the moon, all these things are really contrarian in the sense that they take any bit of evidence and just run with it. All right? The way I always remember contrarians is that did you know if you say the word Halloween really slowly, it sounds a lot like gullible? Dang. All right. Where Silver talks about is the person with self-interest. Self-interest comes in a variety of forms. The first form is economic self-interest. And we see this in a lot of studies within science where people in, back in the 60s and 70s, when the link between tobacco, smoking, and lung cancer was first established, who would have the strongest incentive to push back on that link? Tobacco, right? And so the tobacco industry does push back. They find people who conduct research that says, no, there's no link, all right? If there is a link, it's not causal, it's a correlation. In fact, some people produced research that said the reason people have, it's not that smoking causes cancer, it's that people with cancer like to smoke. You've got it backwards. Right? Seems to me that common sense would say putting things in your lungs might not be good, right? You know, but They needed to push back because of that economic self-interest. Other places where you see this type, and so they produce research grounded in self-interest. Drugs, pharmaceutical companies have a strong self-interest, economic self-interest, in finding that their drugs work. All right. Some drugs have even been discovered when they're trying to do something else. One of the diseases that is widely talked about for people who are elderly now is incontinence. Right? Wasn't really a problem until we discovered a drug that would fix incontinence. Right? And then they started going, oh, you need to be more careful. It's embarrassing. And they started advertising drugs that would fix a problem that had never been anticipated as a problem before. Why? Because there's an economic self-interest to do this. All right? Interestingly, one of the things that I find to be somewhat interesting is that some of the exact same scientists who researched and found that there was no link between smoking tobacco and cancer are some of the exact same people who are researching to demonstrate that there's no link between carbon dioxide and global warming. Their scientific method is one of extreme doubt. In fact, one of the people in the tobacco lobbyists was quoted one time as saying, "Doubt is our product, and these experts provided it." So they knew that they had to cast doubt because of economic self-interest. The second type of self-interest is ideological self-interest. All right? Sometimes we have beliefs which make us unable to process the information before us. We want to believe a certain thing. All right? Interestingly, people who watch both Fox News and MSNBC are often found to score lower than people who watch no news on current events quizzes. What's the line in Billy Madison? "You've made us dumber." Right? That applies to people who watch the sources that agree with them exclusively. All right? We also see it in politicians sometimes, right? The politician is kind of an interesting person because they kind of fit at the intersection of ideological self-interest and economic self-interest. Because if they lose an election, they're unemployed. And so you will see politicians sometimes make really interesting arguments to try and preserve their position in the game when they have to know that they're wrong. Right? I don't see any other way other than this is my only way out. Third category, Nate Silver's kind of interested on this one, is political pundits, the people on TV shows on Sunday mornings, the people who make predictions about what will happen in the political sphere, are wrong so frequently that you are better off to flip a coin when you're trying to decide things. Right? 2 weeks before the election, the week before the election, many Republicans were saying it was going to be a close election. This last presidential election, it will be a coin flip. It will come down to a few ballots. You know, California didn't need to vote, right? That was one of the worries. They were trying not to let people know that the election was really not that close because the Democrats would likely stay home then. Their person has already won and could tip the balance of the House of Representatives. So these people have, what's their self-interest? Their self-interest is twofold. One, they get to be on TV every Sunday if they say something crazy. All right? You don't ever see anybody, there's one person that I really like. She was on our campus this fall, Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's pretty reasoned, I think. She's a historian, and when she's on Sunday morning, she talks through things and gives pretty good explanations. Most of these people just say, take the party line and say something so they can be on again next week. So they get a little bit of money. But part of it is they also do this to support their party. So ideological self-interest becomes the other type. And I'm not just pointing this out. One of my former students is doing a line of research in what he calls motivated reasoning, in which he looks at how people respond to data, to evidence, to claims which counter what they believe. All right? And so what he has done, he's got a couple of experiments going, but the one that is most interesting to me is, remember right after Sandy Hook, the NRA started to push back pretty hard on opposing legislation which would slow the spread of guns or gun control in some form. But one of the things the NRA did was they made a couple of ads which were just blatant falsehoods, right? And, Other people do it as well. He was just using them as the example because the falsehoods were so blatant about what proposed legislation would do. You know, they would make a claim about the proposed legislation that was not in the legislation. And then fact checkers would come along and say, this is wrong, right? And so for his experiment, he had people come in, read, they had to fill out a questionnaire to determine if they were Democrat or Republican, pro-gun control, anti-gun control, and they found that the Democrats, surprisingly, were pro-gun control, and the Republicans were anti-gun control, and so he used political affiliation as the measure. He had them view the ad and then view the fact check back. Okay? And what he found was that the Democrats, when they read the fact check, were really persuaded by how wrong the NRA was, and their opinion moved very strongly, even more strongly than it had been against the NRA. Whereas the Republicans read the fact check and they went, well, maybe our argument isn't as good as it needs to be, but they came up with all kinds of rebuttals to the fact check. Right? Well, we had to say it because it's a really important issue. Right? Some of them said, what? So it's okay to lie? Right? And what he found was that there was very little movement. There was some movement, but very little once confronted with the fact check. And most theories of persuasion would say that what we should do is start to see a convergence, that as we all begin to develop more and more information, as we all get the same information, we should come to a common place of agreement as to what was in that ad. And he found that actually what happened is they got further and further apart, which is concerning. All right? Because the question then becomes, how do we ever reach a state of consensus? If every time we're confronted with different types of information, what happens if we continually move further and further apart? On the other hand, we can have too little self-interest. If we have too little self-interest, what happens? We don't care, right? You know, kind of what I said at the top about Hume and my interest in him. It just doesn't, my interest is not very great. And so instead of thinking about that, I just kind of dismiss it as a somewhat interesting question that I don't care that much about. All right? And so if we get in a situation where we don't care about things, and you all, everybody in here can think of things that are important to other people that you don't care about. Even simple things. My wife loves cats. I don't. She was away yesterday. She got home. Did you remember to feed the cats? Yeah. When? 5 minutes ago, I remembered you were coming home, which made me think how much you like cats. Which I didn't, right? You know, like they don't exist in my world. Right? A Humean question. Do the cats exist? Nah, of course not. All right. The other thing was she had a shopping list for me yesterday, which had 2 things on it. Powdered sugar. She's baking something apparently. And she loves the cinnamon-flavored hearts for Valentine's Day, these little chewy ones. Those were 2 things on the shopping list. And for the life of me, I could not remember what the second thing was. So I had to call her and go, I got the powdered sugar. What was the other thing? She's like, how can you forget? Cinnamon hearts. It's not that hard. It's like, yeah, but they don't matter as much to me, right? Now, if you just said, like, M&Ms, I don't know, 3 bags, right? Not like handbags, like, big bags. So when we don't have self-interest, we don't care, we don't think about these things. Now, the problem is that sometimes we should care, all right? As citizens in a democracy, we should care. We should care when we're talking about going to war. We should care. You know, it's difficult when you're college students to think about the future of Social Security. Wouldn't it be nice to have that 17% or whatever it is back, 7.5% in your paycheck now instead of waiting until you're 62, 65, 67, whatever, when you retire? And so what a lot of times politicians will do is bank on the fact that we don't care, that we're not paying attention when they make decisions that are going to affect us and our culture in the long term. So the first 2 types of skepticism, according to Nate Silver, contrarianism and self-interest. And the third type, he says, is scientific scientific skepticism. And he praises this type of skepticism. He thinks it's the way out. All right? He thinks that scientific skepticism is very effective. He thinks it has a couple of components, which we'll touch on. The first one is that it's 2-sided. In fact, some people, when they talk about science, will define science as the practice of methodological skepticism. All right? In other words, we always question things. And the second thing they'll talk about in terms of science is it needs to be two-sided. You don't just question one side of the issue, you question both sides of the issue. And the example Silver works through here really is the global warming issue. He says that there's almost no doubt amongst scientists that global warming is caused by humans. Right? That theory goes back to the late 1800s as to what CO2 does. What there is doubt about among scientists is how accurate the models are in predicting what the effects will be. All right? And why do they mess this up? Right? Why can it be difficult? Because those models depend on a lot of variables. If you do a little bit of reading about global warming, one of the big variables is clouds. And clouds don't just, like, when you're running these models, they're talking about things like warming in the Arctic or warming in the Great Plains states, right? They're not talking, clouds don't form over the Great, like there's not a big cloud over Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska one day, right? They're spotty, and so how they affect things, they're not always so sure of. There are theories which they're always modifying, trying to figure out how much oceans are a carbon sink, how much carbon dioxide can the oceans hold before a lot of people say that they will burp, right? Which would be a burp I would want to see. Right? When they just start emitting CO2, when they're saturated with CO2. Other things they can't predict. Volcanoes have a huge impact in terms of putting sulfur particles into the atmosphere. So they cannot predict when a volcano is going to go off, and that has massive effects in terms of how much warming is going on. So that's Silver's proposed solution, but can't answer very well the thing that we just talked about, motivated reasoning. Why is it that when people confronted with different evidence will oftentimes diverge rather than converge? And so I think we have a very sad situation in our culture right now. We are we're skeptical, often with good reason. All right? Part of it is skepticism of our government. Now we have all heard about the NSA, right? If you haven't, they have heard about you. But the NSA, when I was in college, was a group I wanted to work for. All right? I didn't have any way to make it happen. I just thought it'd be a cool job. Why? Because for 2 decades they denied that they existed. That's some power, right? Like, every now and then Congress would be like, "What's this about the National Security Agency?" And they'd be like, "What National Security Agency?" Right? There's no such thing. Yeah, it was there, right? They were doing they took over the dirty work of the CIA for 2 decades, and we just kind of pretended that it wasn't going on. So we have a reason to be distrustful sometimes, all right? I already mentioned that the internet just complicates this. Anything you want to find out, you can find out on the internet. You can find out things for opposite sides. You can usually find a qualified person who says it, right? And isn't it Abraham Lincoln who said anything on the internet is true? I saw that quote the other day, right? So we can find this stuff, and we're not very good at being skeptical about it. Why? Look at some of the websites. Some of the worst websites have some of the best design. You look at it and you go, "Oh, what a great website. It must be right. They took a lot of time to do this." Or they'll have qualifications, or they'll have a really nice name, right? The Republicans last week got in I think a lot of trouble. Google started labeling some of their websites as phishing websites because they had ads for Democrats. Like, in one congressional district, they took the Democrats' ad and copied it, and in the middle put in money for for whatever her name was, and then under money for donate for, what's her name? They put donate for the defeat of in little letters. And so they were like, "Oh, that's not deceptive. You just have to be a good," they were trying to, and Google comes out and puts up, "Don't go to this website when you try and click, be careful of what's going on here." All right? So we fall for that stuff. Right? We fall for good names. We fall for things that we tend to trust. And that makes Nate Silver conclude He says there's no reason to conclude that the affairs of men are becoming more predictable. The opposite may well be true. The same sciences that uncover the laws of nature, or his argument is that we confuse the signal, what we should pay attention to, with the noise, all the data that can confuse us. So if that's the case, what do we need to do to start to reason our way out of this? Okay. The first answer is one that you'll hear people say from time to time. In my slideshow, actually I had a picture of one of the big advocates of this. When I said the phrase common sense solution, does anybody's name come to mind? I mean, one does right away. Sarah Palin. Right? How many times does she use the phrase common sense solution? Right? And historically, we've tried the common sense solution before. There was a whole body of philosophy responding to Hume called the common sense philosophers in the late 18th century. Guys like Thomas Reid, George Campbell, Henry Home Lord Keynes wrote about ways to answer skepticism. And their answer was, you'd be crazy to believe the things that Hume says. You'd be crazy not to believe the following list of things which were identified as the core principles of common sense. Right? The first one is existence of God. Right? The second one is repeatability. Right? That because the sun comes up every day, it will come up again tomorrow. So empiricism becomes part of it. And they come up with about 4 or 5. And then what happens is every time they really get stuck on something that they want to believe, and Hume goes like, oh, what about this? What about this? They go, common sense. Right? So they start out a list of 4 or 5 common sense principles and end up with some get close to 100. All right, of common sense things that you'd be crazy to dispute. So we've tried common sense before, and it often doesn't work. The other problem is when people say you need to use some common sense, what are they really saying most of the time? At least in my experience.
Believe what I believe.
Yeah. And if I go, why? You're like, because I believe it. Right? There's very little ability to reason out from common sense. And so it's often used as a defense mechanism. Oh, that's just common sense. Right? Well, why is it common sense? Right? So I'm going to suggest a different place that we can go to start to try and resolve some of this difficulty. And it's a little bit biased. What I do is I study argument. And I think argument is the best place that we can go to start to answer some of these questions, to start to resolve this. Silver posits this in science and probability studies, and I'm not sure that's quite right. Right? Because the problem that we have, if you go back, his model explains perfectly what goes on, why there's a divergence in these studies of like the NRA response to the NRA ads. His model actually does explain that. He thinks it doesn't, but it does. And so I'm going to suggest a slightly different model, and that's the study of argument. And I think there's 4 characteristics of argument that are really important to keep in mind as we talk about this. The first is that in an argument, there are at least 2 sides to every issue. At least 2 sides to every issue. A lot of times when we talk about argument, we'll say, oh, or the science where we'll say there's 2 sides. Many times there's more than 2 sides. Right? And sometimes I'll take positions for fun, right? Like I'll just take a position I don't really believe to argue with someone. You know, not mean spirit, usually just to kind of tease them, all right? It's like one of the big issues in the United States right now is the issue of gay marriage, right? Should it just be same-sex marriage? Should you be able to marry, or should you have to marry? I'm not saying this is all correct. You all know what it is, right? Every now and then I'll just take a position, ban marriage. Right? State has no interest. State should not be involved in my life, which is a very libertarian attitude. Right? Why does the state give me a piece of paper that says I'm married? My church can do that. My wife and I can decide that. It's none of the government's business. Right? People look at me and go, oh, no. Why? Right? Why would we do that? Well, why did we tax breaks? We need more money in the government, right? And there used to be a marriage penalty in the taxes. So maybe we don't even need an institution of marriage at the government level. It can be handled other ways. All right? So there's more than 2 sides to that question. So the first thing is to keep in mind there's at least 2 sides. The second thing about argument is that argument deals with the probable or the contingent. And this goes back to the days of Aristotle. The mistake that we often make afterwards, where should we stop? Well, we want to beat the team home. We don't want to get behind the bus on the roads. So we'll drive through McDonald's in Charles City. And perfectly rational decision, all right? Not really, it's McDonald's. As we're getting ready to go through drive-through, pickup truck with a snowplow on the front throws it in reverse and backs up really fast and hits us. Right? Empirically, we made a bad decision, I suppose. Right? But no, will we ever make that same decision again? Yes. Why? Because the odds of that happening are really small. Right? If we lived like that, you'd never get out of bed. Right? You would always be able to say, oh, there's a risk that today I'm going to get hit by a car. There's a risk that today the elevator line is going to break and I'm going to fall 3 floors to my death. Right? So I'll just stay in bed. We understand that it works with the world of the probable. And that's true in many places. When presidential candidates tell us something, I will do this, we know that it may not happen. Or when they say, this will happen as a result of this policy, we probabilize that, right? It's not to say that they're against it, right? When Obama says 36 million people, or whatever the magic number was, will get health insurance, I didn't go, oh yeah, it'll be 36 million. Not 36 million and one, right? 36 million. Instead, we start to go, how many will there, we start to probabilize that. The third thing about argument is we live in the world of action. Every day, and this is the thing that I believe makes argument different from almost any other place, the reason we make decisions is we're trying to make decisions about what we should do. Right? When, as we think through things, we need to reason through and make decisions about what we should do. In COM 100, or whatever number it is now, they changed it since I've been here, they used to say, one cannot not communicate. And you remember that little ditty? All right? I've never believed that. What I do believe is one cannot not act. Every moment of our lives, we're in action. We're making decisions about what we do. And if you go, I can only act on the basis of complete and 100% knowledge, you don't act, and you're stuck. Okay? So lastly, what's the basis for this knowledge, for this ability to act? I think it really resides in the liberal arts core for most of us. Right? It's the ability to write and read. Really importantly, the ability to ask questions and answer questions. It should involve things like history. There are things that we should know based on a read of history. And we should be careful when people try to redefine, rewrite our history and go, what's going on here? Right? We should be able to read part of that history ourselves. Right now there's a big controversy. What did the New Deal do? Was it good or bad within history? Well, it was largely settled for decades. Why is it being revisited? And the last thing about that, I kind of made fun of this, but we also need to look at what the experts tell us. And we need, at many times, need to trust the consensus of experts. I can go on the internet and find people that disagree, but the people who spend their lives studying certain issues are the people I should trust most of the time, right? When people get on the internet, Nicole Smith, wasn't she one that's like, oh, my kid's got autism and it's caused by this shot that he got. And then, like 2 months ago, said, oh, wait, he doesn't have autism. Jenny McCarthy. They all blend together for me. So they're all good parents. If I had a mom, I wish my mom would have been one. No. So we need to look at what the experts tell us. We can, and most of the time what happens is, there's a book out right now that I need to go find called The Cult of the Amateur, in which the notion is we get on the internet, we look stuff up, and we become convinced that we know more than our doctor. Right? And if you listen to doctors right now, one of their biggest complaints is people who come in telling them what their prescription needs to be. Because they found it on the internet. Right? And that's a place you don't want to go either. So our skepticism needs to be grounded in things that we have the ability to reason through. And we need to look very carefully at what the people who are really studying these things for certain tell us and do. And so I think the answer to this notion of an unhealthy skepticism is best found in argumentation. We have a little bit of time for questions. Maybe we have any questions.
I just say, yeah, I find it interesting what you're saying about the quote experts, like, for example, people that were dismissing global warming. It's interesting that a lot of the same people, like you said, that were involved in tobacco and global warming, a lot of these people had great scientific reputations, but just because you're a physicist doesn't mean that you're an expert on atmospheric physics or climatology not necessarily in regard to tobacco, that you're an expert on epidemiology or toxicology. So you want to look, be more skeptical when somebody, they've gotten a member of the National Academy of Sciences or a physicist. So what? If they're talking on something that they really haven't spent their life on, sciences and everything is so specialized, be very, very skeptical of what these people are saying.
Right. And in global warming, one of my favorite examples of that is one of the groups that has the largest amount of skeptics is meteorologists.
Yes.
And their reason is, if I can't predict the weather for tomorrow, how can you predict it 10 years down? Well, those are two very different exercises, is the answer. One's looking at trends. One of the things Nate Silver points out in his book is that long-range forecasting is not very good for the weather. By long range, he means more than 5 days. You are actually better to predict what the weather will be in 7 days, to go back and look at what the historical average is, than to listen to the meteorologists. Because it changes that much, all right? But that's not the same as the trend of global warming, global climate change.
Yeah, weather is different than climate.
Yeah, and so you've got two different groups. But people tend to go, oh, if the weather person says it, that's their area. Well, it's, as you said, it's not their area. It's very specialized.
Any other questions? Okay, let's give one more round of applause. Just a couple of notes for you guys. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Kim Macklin. She'll be speaking in about 10 minutes on snapped judgments in eyewitness context. Seeing is not always believing. We also have a keynote speaker tonight at 7 p.m., Garrett Thomas. He's a magician. I recommend that all of you come because he's going to be awesome. And that will be right here at 7. Additionally, if you guys are interested in filling out our online form, giving Darwin Week a rating, how you liked it, how you liked the speakers, you can find that form on Unify's Facebook page or Unify's Darwin Week event. So if you want to fill that out, that'd be great. Thank you.
This one actually isn't long for This is around time for that. That one's happening at 3:01. But I'll initial it. Yeah, no, you don't. It's actually long. I'll initial it.
You should tell Margaret how you should professionally read stories, how they take it professionally. Like, people call you and pay you by the minute to read stories. She said that?
Yep.
She said that?
Oh, I didn't know French either. Yeah, I don't know. Title. Summary just kind of probably just an hour. Summary of what they talked about.
Oh, yeah.
An hour about it. Yeah, about 45 minutes to 15 minutes. All right. Something that we plan to put up.
Okay, so summary on
You probably have plenty of notes. You just,
what was this other again?
Josh French. On the website. You can have a thing that says his name on it. I don't know. Yes, that'll be everyone. Yes, this talk is called A Healthy Doses of
Okay, about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
Is that
Oh, yeah.
what is that?
Yeah, I talked to someone and he said that they get credit regardless for that one, so I just sent him an email. So shoot for having that paragraph ready then.
Okay,
Does that work for you?
Email it to me.
okay, what's your email?
SHEWA.
If you look at the bright light, you see.
Yeah.
I've heard both ways. Okay.
I'm skeptical.
That's all I want. So it's
Planning on going to talks?
I'll be back.
you should write something about going out.
Huh?
Oh, you don't think I've been together.
Yes, it is. For the paycheck. I'm gonna get
Thank you.
No, thanks.
Are you guys mission?
Yeah.
I'll see you
All
there.
right, I took your class.
I invited all of my honors programs. I bought the book once. I bought all of them.
Actually, I've always done all the homework, but I like asking questions and like making comments and like I feel like people good participate more or less. But today he was more like do a job. I will touch those after. Oh yeah. I love the book bags. You want to send them out like
So I'm not sending them out. I'm just taking them.
yeah. We had 50 people at our last talk, so that's great. Yeah. Cool. So there's some technical difficulties at the beginning, but that's every time, no matter what. Right. And we are. Really? Computer? Yeah. Sorry, no, I. I don't know if we need to announce that at the beginning. At the end, it's good. So, yeah, we want to know about it before. Oh, I guess you can mention. And they're on all the shirts now. Very cool. It's super hot. Yeah, it's the table over here. I know. It's real great. I used to overhear about watch like one episode first and shut up. It's a good life.
They wait to do more pictures.
Like the Dow, Skepticism, or the secular Dow. No, we have enough the black one, so Darwin. Yeah, dude.
Should I just stop these slides? Yep.
Also, the slide clicker changer thing is not working. So let her know. But the laptop
I don't know
is,
what
yeah.
Tucker was saying that she thought that the whole thing was
Yeah.
working. And then after that, I was like, sorry, it wasn't working. And I was like, but you know the keys were working. I was like, oh. So whatever.
Yeah, I felt like we knew too, and then right at the beginning, I was wait. It worked out. Yeah, it was fine. I don't, his slides are mostly just he had like his own,
Oh, that's for free.
yeah, I'm assuming Robert is going to use PowerPoint to see some props classes.
Really?
Or, sorry, pop culture, anyways.
Oh.
Okay, do you really have headphones? I want to make sure he's working. So if you can hear it there, they're probably working, so it's fine. I mean, you could, turn it up.
do it a little right over. Okay. Yeah, take notes on what's there.
Oh, yeah. Like all the time. Which one is this again? I should know it.
Did you get it? Oh, I don't know. Actually, that would be totally fine. Thank you.
Yeah, it's
For her, like, long class, actually.
Burt Macklin.
Yeah, Burt Macklin's mom. No, there's lots more places. It seemed to work better.
Editors have a new view.
Yeah.
Can you use this better?
So product of the 60s consensus.
Wow. Better get some work done.
Most of them.
But also your Germans.
Are you the techie guy?
No.
You're like the camp?
No.
You're not?
I don't know how to do stuff like that.
Yeah. Where does it go from here?
To the NSA.
Sell out. I'm selling out by going on what is it, YouTube? You're gonna put me on YouTube?
Yes. You'll be commercialized. Advertisements will be linked to you speaking, and you'll never be able
Yeah,
to
it's like
escape that stigma.
everyone is on YouTube.
That's a
I'm sure
brand
you're
even
on.
more indelible than Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter.
Sure. You're on YouTube.
Nothing.
All the more reason to believe you must be on. So, will you help me like put my I guess I'm gonna stick around. Are these kind of fun?
Yeah. Oh,
Well, you know what's weird is like I saw the list of presentations and they look pretty academic and mine's just a kind of what you guys call my rants. One of my rants. I'm just gonna go on one of my rants for well, how long am I supposed to get? Time, 2 hours.
Or whatever. Were you getting ready for environmental class? I was like,
I was just gonna, no.
yeah. Also,
Environmental was last semester. All right, so we have no club. I have a wrist clock. I have one of them new wrist clocks.
we can do that for you.
A Sunday.
Okay, so. Thanks. Are you introducing me?
Of course. I made a workout one. But aliens. Yeah. No. Natalie, what did you say? You say that conspiracy theories aren't healthy. They aren't healthy. There's some people that believe everything. I don't believe in every single line. Theory. I just know that it was us that ran ourselves into the towers in 9/11. Oh boy. Still say that by the camera, I can hear you. Let it go. Renditions. Oh. I don't know if they have have it down there anymore because Michaela works the street. That would be awesome. She was working on the habit track. She had a couple questions for me. Yeah.
I forgot to come there. I walk in with you.
Yeah, I have told her.
Yeah, probably. That's pretty high expectations.
It's not low too. She works the back.
But I've never heard you You don't get a grade.
Might not definitely sit here and watch it.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 3 o'clock Darwin Week lecture. We are about to hear Dr. Kim Macklin give her lecture on snap judgments in eyewitness context. Seeing is not always believing. Professor Macklin holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Nevada, Reno, with a specialization in the social psychology of law. She is currently a professor of psychology and law at UNI. She is a teacher, researcher, author, and legal consultant. Her research focus is on criminal stereotypes and eyewitness memory and identification. Kim is co-founder of the Institute for Psychological Sciences, which provides consultation, research testimony, and training for attorneys and law enforcement regarding issues related to eyewitness memory and identification. So without further ado, Dr. Macklin.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how people make very quick decisions in everyday life always, but in particular when they are in crime situations and when they are in the situation of being an eyewitness. So we see what we want, and I will talk a little bit more about varieties of ways where we see and believe things incorrectly. So it's very compelling when a witness says, "I saw it with my own eyes." You know, I saw him there at the park with his new girlfriend. And then if you see the front, you see he's sitting next to his dog. Is that we don't always know what we see, but we put a great deal of faith in what we do see. And even more faith in what we believe based on what we see. Those beliefs become very, very strong. Many times that we are wrong in the recollections of what we see, and thus our beliefs about what we saw or we thought we saw are also incorrect. And this matters a lot when we're using memories as evidence. It may not matter so much in day-to-day situations if you get someone's name wrong, you accidentally go up and grab someone in line and then they turn around, it's not who you thought they were. You might have embarrassing social situations, but it's not critical to your day-to-day life. But when memory is used as evidence, it has a whole new level of importance. And so if we move forward and think, how can we consider memory as evidence? We consider it as trace evidence like anything else. So you're probably familiar with the notion that there's trace evidence like hair and fiber, blood splatter, fingerprints, and we know that those things are sort of residues of something else, and that by collecting that information, we can learn more about what happened at the scene of the crime. Well, memory evidence is trace as well, except that it's very difficult to bag and tag, right? Because it's riding around in the eyewitness's head. And so as with all of these other types of evidence, it's really important to collect and preserve that evidence very carefully. we can imagine that if someone brushed up against this blood splatter, that would be problematic. It would be contaminating the scene. That we can see up there with the fingerprints, that easily those fingerprints could be smudged, or we could have contaminating fingerprints like the analyst there who isn't even wearing a glove. And evidence can be lost as well. So a hair and fiber could be lost at the scene or even once collected. The Ziploc bag or the container could be lost. Memory evidence is the same way. It can be lost forever if it's not collected properly, and it can be incorrectly collected such that it becomes difficult to use at trial, or worse, leads jurors to erroneous conclusions. So the eyewitness is in a special situation, but they're not very special at all. They are ordinary people with an ordinary brain, and sometimes they might be in extraordinary circumstances, like being a bank teller when a bank robber comes into the lobby. But most often in crime situations, they are actually fairly everyday situations. You witness a horrible accident, you're driving by someone and you see a scuffle, and so your everyday brain is working with everyday situations, and it may only become later that you realize that what you saw mattered in a crime context. So we're not always even aware that our memory might be important until after the fact. And this is really problematic when memory is used as evidence. And so the memory of various events that people are exposed to then become evidence. If something terrible happened to me right now, someone came in and threw me down on the ground or shot me, you all would be eyewitnesses to that event, and your memory then would be important. And we'd have some benefit of the fact that you are paying attention. You are focusing your attention up here, you're here to listen to me speak. So you may have some better information than someone else, but if you were just casually sitting in the union and something happened, you may not have as good of information because you weren't paying attention. But your memory likely still would become part of the evidentiary process because officers and other people would say, but you were right there. You were right near her. You must have seen something. Think about it. Let us know what you saw. Let us know what you remember. So why does this even matter? Why are we even talking about it? And it can't be wrong. It's a fallible biological system. But it matters because of the situation of wrongful conviction. To date, this was as of Saturday, 312 people have been exonerated due to DNA evidence. So that means that they were charged and convicted and served time, many of them 10 or even 20 years in prison for crimes that they did not commit. And ultimately they were released only because DNA evidence came to light or it was finally allowed to be tested. And once it was tested, they could be completely confirmed that they were not the perpetrator of that crime. The scary part of this is very few criminal cases actually have DNA evidence. Now, we have no reason to believe that this sort of proportion of people who are wrongfully convicted would be any different in any other type of criminal case. So while we can get a proportion of people out of prison who were wrongfully convicted, what about all the people who are in cases who have no DNA to test? And so that is extremely concerning for those of us who work with law enforcement and the courts, is how do we make memory evidence really strong and useful to jurors and judges. So if you look more closely at this chart, the other concerning thing and why psychologists come into play in this debate is that of all of the DNA exonerations, at least the first 225 where analyses have been done, we see that the biggest reason, 77% of those cases, the reason why the person was convicted was based on an eyewitness identification. Someone said, that's him. I know it. I will never forget that face. He did that to me. And that's extremely compelling evidence. So you've got 173 out of 225 cases where the main reason why they were convicted was because an eyewitness was wrong. Okay? So that's why we care about memory being used as evidence. Now, there are ways to make memory evidence better, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, but we're going to explore some of these issues further. So how do we remember? Well, we first must pay attention. So your parents and your teachers who have always said, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, they were right. You have to orient your biological sensory systems to information in the environment if you hope to have it enter the brain and then be available for possible memory use later. Okay? So I can't see what's going on behind my head. I don't have any sensory receptors at the back of my head to be able to tell what shape my hand is in, okay? Or anything else behind me. And now that I think about it, I can't really remember what is behind me. And I can't see it because my biological system for detecting light waves is oriented in front, not currently in the back. And so if I don't orient my biological system to the physical energy in the environment that it's designed to capture, then I am not going to be able to perceive that information. And if I can't perceive it, I'll never be able to remember it. So attention is critical. There's several different kinds. But as a definition, you can think of the focus of your attention determines what you will be able to perceive, and later what you are able to maybe remember. So if we look at this little boy here, he's cutting apples. I finally determined, I'm like, is it bananas or potatoes? It looks to be apples. And you can see he's highly oriented to the stimuli. Okay, he's looking down very carefully at the sharp knife. His fingers are tucked back. He's watching what he's doing. He's very intent. This is goal-directed attention. It's what you do when you're trying to learn something. You are all, for the most part, if so, doing goal-directed attention. You're oriented up here. Okay? It's what we do when we are trying to actively take information in the environment. Now, the other kind is stimulus-driven capture. And this would be the situation where something goes on that drags your attention to it. So I can hear a really loud noise, and several of you turned your heads over there. And you probably saw me start to do it, and it might have distracted you, but that's what your biological system is designed to do. Like, remember, because I've done that before, I walk out and don't have my keys. So we are oriented to that because a loud noise is informative, and we need to know what is going on in that situation. Same as when you're driving and a deer runs out in front of you. Stimulus-driven capture is saying, you have to look here now. It's really important. And you could imagine that in some crime situations, that indeed is what is happening. Okay, there's a loud noise, someone's acting strangely, there's a gun, there's a sound. But many crimes occur where there isn't that stimulus-driven capture. You had to have been paying attention to have been able to notice anything. And so we also know that we can't remember what we do not see. So this student sleeping during a lecture is not going to magically be able to know what was talked about that day. The information does not let him go to the table and soak through his skin, right? He's not orienting any of his biological resources to the environment so that he could possibly remember. So this attention process is critical, and it's something that many law enforcement officers don't pay attention to. That they assume that if you were in the immediate vicinity, you must have good information about the crime. And it takes quite a bit of education with law enforcement officers to encourage them to realize that some people really may not have seen anything and may not have useful information for the investigation. So if we're attending to something, if we're capable of attending to something, we're not asleep, we're not inebriated, we're not unconscious, and we are actually present, what is it possible for us to perceive? For light energy, we actually only see a very, very, very small part of the light spectrum. So this is all the available light energy that's coming towards us, and we can only see that small band. So there's lots and lots and lots of stuff to see in the world that we cannot see, that our biological system is not designed to detect. Okay? So it has to be of a very certain and particular wavelength for us to have the opportunity to see it all. Sound, it's possible to hear a tick of a watch. I'm not sure if some of you realize what a watch is, but it's the thing we used before we used our phone to tell us what time it was. And so you can hear that at 20 feet under quiet conditions. We can taste a teaspoonful of sugar in a gallon of water. You'll get a very faint sugar taste, and we can do that by, in all of these situations, by evaluating what is the minimal amount of stimulation necessary to detect the stimulus. Okay, so we know that the minimal amount for most people is a teaspoonful of sugar in a gallon of water. Smell is actually 1 drop of perfume in a 3-bedroom apartment. So think about that the next time you put on your cologne or your perfume, is we don't need all that. Okay, we have very sensitive detection for smell. Touch, we can feel the brush of, say, like an insect, or even if you just do it with your fingers, about 1 centimeter away from the skin. Okay, the mechanism of fluffing air near you can be detected at that close. So we have the abilities, these particular abilities, and they're far inferior to some other biological organisms' abilities to detect things in the environment, and they're different than some biological organisms' abilities to detect things in the environment. But this is what we can do, okay? And it's important to understand these possibilities for, in particular, in eyewitness situations with vision and in terms of sound, is the possibilities of being able to see things. And so when someone says, well, I know he was wearing an orange coat when he ran away from the scene, it's important to evaluate what time of day it was, what was the lighting. Halogen lighting can make white coats look orange. These are the things that someone like me would evaluate in a court case to say, is it possible that they saw what they saw? What's the likelihood that they're correct or incorrect, so that we can pass on to the judge and the jury that this evidence looks pretty strong, this eyewitness memory evidence, or we have concerns about this eyewitness memory evidence. And so memory is then the capacity to preserve and recover information. And importantly, these are the basis of our beliefs. And they're ours. They feel very much like that we hold them true. And it's very difficult for people to think about that you might believe things that in fact are not true. It feels really kind of strange and uncomfortable. But there's actually several different types of memories that I'll just go over really quick. There's sort of the names and facts memories, so Trivial Pursuit, Jeopardy, fact-based memory. There's procedural memory, like how to tie your shoe, how to ride a bike, how to tie a tie. These memories are largely nonverbal, and you can tell that if you try to describe to someone, tell me in words how to ride a bike. What will happen is the person usually will start acting it out. They're like, okay, well, you get on and you go, right? It's hard to describe, and it's because it's a different form of memory than most of our other memories. We might use lists to enhance our memory of information, but mostly what people think of when they think of real memories is episodic memory, the episodes of our life, the time we went to Disneyland, the time that guy loved me. And so that, when people say what is memory, they think of episodic memory, but we do have lots of other forms of memory. Also in terms of like spatial memory, where did you park your car in the Walmart parking lot? Is how do we gain information from the environment, store it, and then how do we bring it back up later when we can use it? So seeing isn't always believing. If something is so contrary to what we believe, we will not believe what we see. We will not believe what is right in front of us. And those biases, those stereotypes, those expectations can be very strongly held and greatly influence our perception of events. You might remember a few weeks ago, this guy, he posted a picture of his children on his blog. He was trying to show his wife, like, look how awesome I am. I'm like getting the kids ready in the morning for school. And he got an untold amount of grief from this. Does anybody remember this story? He got a lot of grief from this. He was really surprised. He thought it was a really cute picture of him and his kids, and he knew his wife would be tickled, and it's something that he does all the time. Okay? And he got a lot of sort of hate comments about this, people saying that they probably weren't his own kids, that they were too light, that no man does that, no man has a big kid in a baby pack and doing his daughter's hair, that he just like sort of rented these kids for a promotional piece, or really sort of strange, hateful comments. And he wrote a thoughtful piece about it later, just saying he just really thinks that people's conceptions of black men are of not taking care of children, and that stereotype, that expectation, really colored what everyone saw about it, or thought about what they saw. Because it really is just a cute picture of a dad taking care of his kids, but that's not what a lot of people saw. Okay? In fact, some people interpreted that he was hurting that little girl, that he was pulling her hair too hard, all sorts of strange things that people supposed because their own expectations were coloring their perception of the event. Depending on your belief system, you may have a hard time believing that she is a Harvard scientist or that he is a professor at Columbia. You may see a young black man running and assume that he's in trouble or being chased by the police as opposed to rushing home for dinner or out jogging. And so what we see is filtered through what we believe. And so I'll go back here a second. So seeing isn't always believing, except when it is. We often incorrectly hold beliefs based on what we think we see or thought we saw or heard all the time. So I'm going to read you a list here. You don't need to write anything down. Just listen to me read this list to you. Rest, sheets, night, snooze, bed, doze, pillow, dream, snore, awake, tired, wake, blanket, slumber, nap, yawn, drowsy. Now if you can scrounge a pen or a pencil, I'd like you to jot down as much as you can remember from that list that I just read. And if you don't have a writing utensil, just start to reflect in your head a few that you can remember and how many you can remember. And I'll just give you a few more seconds on that. Not all of you have the benefit of having a pen or a pencil, but for, say, someone who did not have something to write anything down with, what are some of the words you remember me saying?
Hello.
I said hello. Okay.
Hello.
Pillow. Okay, good. That's closer, right? Pillow. What else?
Awake.
Okay, wake, awake, and snooze. Any other people who couldn't write anything down? Any words you remember?
Nap.
Nap.
Drowsy, yawning.
Okay. The others? Yeah.
Blanket.
Blanket and what?
Blanket.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah. Sheets. Sheets. Any others? Okay, those of you who are able to jot some things down, what words did you remember?
Snore was one.
Okay.
Dream.
Dream.
Yawn.
Yawn.
Doze.
Doze.
Slumber, maybe?
Slumber, maybe? Did anybody who wrote anything down, did anybody write down the word sleep?
Yeah.
How many people wrote down or recollect me saying the word sleep? Raise your hands. Hi, it's okay. Okay? So, in fact, I did not say the word sleep, and when you do this properly, like when everyone has passed out pencils, is that we can usually get about 3/4 of the audience to say that they heard me say the word sleep. And you would be a really persuasive witness. I'm paying attention. This wasn't even just a class I had to go to. I wanted to be here. I could hear her. I was close.
That was the first one I wrote.
It was the first one you wrote down. He works with me. He should know better. I mean, and if you prompt people, if you do this in a more formal experimental setting, you can get people to really confabulate on that memory. Saying, well, I know she said sleep because it was third from the bottom, or I know she said sleep because when she said it, she went like this. You can get people to remember lots of really cool stuff about something that never happened. And so that memory that you have, because you weren't trying to, no winning or losing here, you remembered it. That's why you wrote it down. You wouldn't, if he had written down below, you might wonder what was going on. But if you wrote down what you remembered. And memory is great that way, especially in educational contexts. Sort of more is better. But in evidentiary situations, we become concerned when we can actually fairly easily, in a situation like this, have people misremember something that was so right in front of them. So you'd be wrong. An interesting thing is that witnesses' beliefs about their own memory, their own idea of what's going on, does change over time, and it changes in a really interesting direction. These eyewitnesses are very persuasive, especially by the time going to get to court. So you think of a crime happening in October, that may not go to court until the next July. And they've had many opportunities to rehearse their memories since then. Interviews with police, talking with family, getting ready with the attorneys prior to trial. And this is really great unless they're wrong, right? So if you have a really persuasive witness up there that says, she did it, I know she did, and she's right, bonus. We get to use that information, the jurors can use that information, and it's all good. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know if they're right or wrong. And so we have this situation. Witnesses' confidence increases over time. So this is the time of the crime, and usually right at the time of the crime, they're sort of not sure. They're nervous still, and they're like, I'm not sure if I'm right, but this is my selection. Like, this is the person who did it, whether it's an eyewitness ID or giving someone a name. And this is the person. But we see that confidence steadily increases over time to the point of trial. And again, really awesome if they're right. But if we consider that accuracy doesn't change, if they're wrong, we've got a real big problem. Because jurors would be very careful about a witness that said, this person did it, but I'm not that sure. They would weigh the information differently than the situation that we get at trial, which is this person did it and I'm 100% sure. Okay, so we really get concerned about that. Confidence does not predict accuracy. Just because someone is sure does not mean they're right. And this goes back to a fundamental principle, is that the goal of our visual system is to make sense of the world. That's what our brain is trying to do, to make sure that we step over things that could trip us, that we don't fall down, that we recognize people that are important, that we navigate the world successfully. It was not designed to provide photographic evidence of a scene, of being able to completely determine what someone looked like in the presence of all objects in the presence of all objects in the room. It was never designed to do that. So it's really, really good at what it was designed to do, but it's not so good at how it's used in a court situation. And we can even look at this little simple example here, something that a common object that we see fairly frequently, a penny, and when you look at it, it's like, which is correct? And I still almost always feel like I don't know, even when I've seen this slide a million times. How many people think that this one's correct? We got about 5 or 6 people. How many think this one's correct? And how many people still kind of aren't sure looking at both of them? And me neither. Someone can check. I think that one's right. I'm not positive. I'd have to look. But and so it's sort of like, that's so strange. How could we not remember such a familiar object in the environment? And the reason is we don't need to. Okay, we don't need to remember what a penny looks like. It's our only copper coin. They're not much value. You don't see rampant counterfeiting of pennies, so we don't need to evaluate the details of a penny, okay? And yet that very same thing that protects our brain from soaking up too much information, like just freaking out from too much information in the environment, it's trying to help us. You don't even know that. You don't even, I got it covered, right. That same brain, that same memory system is what's being used when you're being questioned and you were right there, what did she say? And so that dichotomy is critical to understand. Sometimes we remember more and sometimes we remember a lot less. This is a classic study in psychology where participants were asked to remember a word list. They were asked to study it in 2 different contexts. They were asked to study it either on land or underwater, like snorkel and laminated sheet. And then they were had to recall, basically take a test about that list on land or underwater. And we can see that their memory varied. So these are adults, they have intact memory systems, they're smart enough to remember a list. And yet, some people remembered more and some people remembered less. And what this went on to show was that those who tested, who learned and then tested the information in the same context, land, or underwater, remembered more than those who learned and tested in opposite contexts. Okay? Now, why would you think that this wouldn't be equal? This is land, and this is underwater. If the principle is that you learn and test at the same location, you're going to do fine. Why is this one still lower?
Because it's weird.
It's weird. We don't typically take tests with a snorkel underwater, right? It's not normal. We have much more experience doing this, okay? Our brain builds on experiences to make sure that we don't have to use resources unnecessarily. So when I came in here today, I've been in this room many times. I figured there'd be a podium. I figured there would be a laptop. I figured all this stuff. But if I hadn't been on a college campus and I just wasn't sure what was going on, I might be very uncertain of my surroundings, taking in all the information instead of just zeroing in right on the podium. And so our brain does that to us so that we can protect the resources we have, expend them when necessary. And so we can remember more and less, even though that same sensory perceptual system gathered that information. And yet the output was very different. So memory can become contaminated, and an important part that we have to talk about with police is that we forget that forgetting is normal, that information does decay over time, that you don't hopefully remember the list that you took to Hy-Vee 3 nights ago for the stuff you needed to get for dinner, because why, right? You don't need to. So some stuff is just gone forever. Other stuff is there and could be found with prompting, the proper prompting. And some stuff maybe is there, but is maybe never going to be able to be accessible. And those situations are, again, extremely difficult for law enforcement because we have to explain that if you're trying to get information out of a witness, that information is either not there or it is. But if it is, you have to be very careful how you gather it, because otherwise you will actually create misinformation. And that if you keep prompting someone who doesn't have good memory, you will create misinformation. So this basic understanding of human memory is fairly important. So memory is not a replayable video file, just like your visual system is not taking a snapshot. And many factors can impact the quality and the quantity of our memories. A couple examples are something called retroactive interference. This is where new memories hurt the recovery of old memories. And for many of you, you hopefully don't remember them now, but there was at one point where you remembered your locker combination at say, middle school and then transitioning to a high school. And so your 8th grade locker combination, you remember no problem. Within the first week of your freshman year in high school, you can't remember that locker combination at all, even though you used it for 2 years straight. It was easily memorable. Now you remember your new one. So the new memory sort of overwrote the old memory. But there's also proactive interference, and this is where old memories hurt the establishment and recovery of new memories. And this would be the example of like when we were over in Baker, I would usually get here at a time where none of the parking spots in Gilchrist were available, and I'd have to park across the street in Industrial Technology. Like all the time. Happens all the time. Repeated memory, right? Yet there's that one day where I like get the awesome second row non-G spot, so you don't get towed, parking spot, and where am I at the end of the day on a cold day? Wandering around Industrial Technology looking for my car. Totally squandered the opportunity of having an awesome parking spot, and I walked far unnecessarily. So the old memory hurt the establishment and recovery of the new memory that I got a great parking spot today. These are established principles. This isn't magic. We know that these occur. And so a lot of what we do has been communicating with law enforcement and attorneys about ways to understand memories so they can start to evaluate what makes sense in their cases. Are these memories that, as they were collected and recorded, useful enough, good enough to be evidence? One of the main issues about memory is that it is reconstructive in nature. Just like when I read you that sleep list, it was easier for you to remember lots of items from that list. It's about a 20-item list. Most people in a situation where you actually have a pencil can remember anywhere from 9 to 12 of them pretty easily. And it's because they were all about a similar concept. They were all about sleep. And so because they were about a similar concept, they sort of jangled related concepts, which is why some of you reported hearing me say sleep when in fact I did not. And that is because of the reconstructive nature of memory. If I gave you 20 completely disparate items and asked you to remember them, the number that you'd be able to remember would be quite a bit smaller than with the list that was about something similar. And it's because you're pulling things together. Well, it was about sleep, so it might have dream might have been in there, pillow might have been in there, all these other words might have been in there because they're similar to the main concept. And so we are constantly piecing together information to then come up with a memory. And you can experience this in your own families, Thanksgiving time, adult siblings getting together, saying, well, remember that year you bought Mom that locket? You didn't buy that, I bought that locket. Everyone's like comparing and contrasting and evaluating the memories, and they're really getting built based on little bits that you have and then even that others have. The problem with reconstructed memory, again, in school contexts, in social contexts, usually okay, no harm, no foul. You remembered a lot of concepts about sleep, and even though you misremembered that the word sleep was in fact not spoken. And that's because it all fits, it all makes sense. If you remember more on an essay test, you're usually not in trouble, right? Especially if it relates to the concept. But again, in an eyewitness context or an evidentiary context, you worry about people reporting stuff that did not actually happen. So I over-talked my slides. So unlike in an educational context, you just can't be concerned with only enhancing memory. Okay? In an evidentiary context, we want only what really happened, not the stuff that might have, coulda, or shoulda, or sort of fits in the context of what you thought you remembered. So memory enhancement techniques are really great for remembering things when you go to the store, for remembering phone numbers, for trying to remember faces and names. These are great. They can be good study habits and study techniques for doing well on exams. But in an evidentiary or law enforcement situation, we have to be really careful of memory enhancement techniques. So leading questions that officers might pose to a witness are usually bad. Okay? You don't want the officer to give the witness too much information. You want them to generate what they remember, because as soon as I say, what color boots is she wearing, you're picturing boots. Well, if I wasn't wearing boots, you're already picturing boots, it becomes part of your memory, it's kind of problematic. It's better to say, was she wearing any shoes or was there any footwear? You leave things more open so that you don't remember boots just because I said boots. Okay, so leading questions are what you're experiencing in the real world because you're using the same system, right? I'm imagining Dr. Leffler in a red sweater, and then I can see her wearing a red sweater. There's all sorts of, those images are the same in my mind. And so then I can start to misremember when I saw her wearing the red sweater. So imagining things is usually not so good. Returning to the scene of the crime can be helpful if it's done right. The idea is if I take you down to Octopus on the Hill, where a crime occurred and you were there, if you're physically there in the scene, your brain and mind don't need to recreate the location of the bar, where the high seating is, where the phonograph record player is. You don't have to do all of that. It's there. And then that can help you reinstate the context to remember critical points of, actually, now that I'm here, I remember the guy was standing there, as opposed to there, or there, or there. So reinstating the context and returning to the scene can be helpful. Hypnosis is notoriously bad in investigative techniques. Again, it puts people in a highly suggestive mood, and it can implant memories as opposed to collect the memory that you're trying to use as the hypnosis guy who comes. And so we look at it very differently, and we get very concerned when we see it used as a memory enhancement technique. Now, interestingly, we know that memory can be impacted by things like stress, and we can look at this as any sort of physiological arousal. This can be extremely happy, you just won the lottery, or extremely freaked out because someone has a gun in your face. And we know that performance, and this can be any kind of cognitive performance on a test, memory performance, anything like that, are very low when stress or arousal is low. So you just wake up, someone wakes you up, and they say, do this math problem. And you're like, what? Right? Your arousal is low, you're not really awake, it's hard to think. Moderate levels give optimum performance, but if you're too freaked out, test anxiety, gun in the face, memory performance goes down. Okay? And we're not going to be able to do as well on our exam. We're not going to be able to remember information about the scene as well because we were too aroused. And we know that that arousal impacts memory. And this is something that's critical to communicate to people because, Usually the person who has the gun in the face was the closest. They saw the person, they talked to them. And we over and over again have to remind people that that doesn't mean their memory is any good, okay? And in fact, their memory is usually only good for one aspect of the scene. Can anyone think what that would be? You've got a gun in your face. The gun. People provide just like crazy, awesome details about the weapon. If they know guns, they can tell you what it is, which I don't, so you know, whatever. But they'll say it was a 11.5-inch knife, and it had a little circle around the blade, and they can give you great detail about the weapon, and very poor detail about the face, the clothing, or other things that can happen. So what's really being stored? In reality, it's all neurochemical and biological activity between neurons. It only feels like we're seeing and remembering red sweaters and faces and cars and things like that. And the brain works really hard to maintain that fiction because it would be sort of unsettling to just feel like it's all zipping and zooming between neurons. We remember stories, we remember the collective. And we just have to remember that all we are really getting in these particular that even when things like illusions are explained, it's really hard to not see the illusion. Even though we know that it's wrong, the feeling and the psychological experience are precisely the same. So the fiction begins really, really early. So in fact, most of you are probably aware that all the imagery that gets put on the back of your eyeball is upside down, right? That's what's being communicated to the brain. I mean, but we don't feel that way. We can like, no, I live in a right side up world. Well, that's the very first thing. The brain flips it for us. So then we're like, oh, that'd be kind of confusing, so I'll flip it for them. So this kind of processing of information happens very, very early on. And so we're continually making sense of our world, as I mentioned earlier, via the context, stereotypes, expectations, and the brain quickly modifies our perceptions and our memories to make sense of what's going on. Classic study done by Elizabeth Loftus, looking particularly at the issue of leading questions with witnesses, where they told some people what happened as the car was approaching the corner. Was there a yield sign or a stop sign? And depending on what sign the officer prompted them with, that's what the person remembered. Problematic. Similarly, another study by Loftus that when you ask people, you saw a traffic accident, you were right there, you were stationary, so you don't have to figure out any like physics of your movement versus their movement. And if the officer says, what happened when the car is contacted, they got lower rates of speed reported than if the car is smashed. Because it influenced them. It provided an expectation that made them think, well, if they smashed, they were going a hell of a lot faster than if they just contacted. So this is one of the definitive, really kind of simple studies that told law enforcement, you cannot ask any questions. You have to be very cautious about the words you use because you will influence the memory because you are creating the memory versus the language you use. Even more so, people imagined something that did not occur at all. More people reported that they saw glass at the scene if they were asked if the car smashed versus if they contacted it or hit. So we can go, well, officer, that guy who said it was a duck is crazy. I swear it was a rabbit who robbed the bank. And it's because we can get the same exact sensory information floating into all of your eyeballs, into all of your brains, and we can have entirely different experiences. And so you can see the duck, is what I see predominantly when I see this. I see the duck, but you can also see the rabbit. Do you see the rabbit? Where the duck, the bill is the ears. Okay, same exact, identical information is hitting your eyeball, but you can have an entirely different psychological experience that would change the memory that you reported. And the fiction continues. You see things that are not there. Those dots that you see dancing around on there are not there. That red square is not there. There is red half or whatever quarter circly line things there. But this is as white as this. Just doesn't look like it. This is not whiter than that. Okay? So even though we know why, and we'll go into it because I'm like rapidly running out of time, that physiologically we know why these things occur, but our experience is so strong, and that's why you become a very compelling witness. I saw a red square. I saw a white triangle. I was right there. I care about this. I'm not lying. I'm not trying to screw around with you. And you become extremely compelling. Who's moving? Are you calling me a liar? Well, it's not moving. But it is moving. But it's not moving. And no other line anywhere is longer than any of the others. Well, it's not. And the middle line is not longer than the others. And so we're continually having to grapple with the situation that our eyes can give us as much information as they can, but it's the brain that's interpreting it. Many people believe that they can be able to recognize someone if they saw them even from like far away. They're like, no, I got a really good look. And you feel like you get some good facial information on that second gal in the chair, but in reality, she's that big. Okay? Like, trust me. Like, my son did not trust me. He had to get a ruler and look on the screen. And he was like, this is one of those psychological tricks. You're tricking me. And I'm like, I'm not tricking you. Your brain is tricking you. But it looks like, oh, we could get some good information about her facial features. But in reality, the information we have about her is extremely blurry and not very good information about her face. Many of you have probably seen this. If you have, don't give it away. Let's hope all our technology works at the moment. So grand. We don't need volume on this because you can see the screen. Just count how many times the players were right past the basketball. How many passes did people count? 15. Anybody count more than that? Less? How many did you count?
I counted 14.
14. Did anybody see anything unusual in the girl? The gorilla? Did other people see the gorilla? Did everyone see the gorilla? Okay, how many people did not see the gorilla? Okay, good. Because otherwise, my little example would really suck. So 15 passes. And if we move forward here, that gorilla walked right in the middle at normal speed and went right in front of your eyes. And guarantee the retinal image displayed it, but you did not see it. Okay? And it's because the focus of your attention was on something else in the environment, which is counting the passes. Here's another one. Get this to where I want it. This is a sort of dead on the street demonstration of a real experiment. So he's a lost pedestrian, and he's going to ask for directions. And so he goes up to her and he asks her where this location is. And ultimately, some people are going to come by, plan, and they're going to interrupt them with the board. Over half of the people don't notice that the guy's totally different. Yeah, I mean, well over half don't know that the guy's different. I mean, that's pretty weird. But again, it's because we don't need to know. The focus of it is giving directions. And over and over again, they don't know. And then he's got a blue hat on. He's like different. You know, we don't need to know. So we code what is relevant. And this is particularly true if you're in a kind of a surprise crime scene situation where you're not expecting something to happen. You're not going to necessarily code the relevant details because you're focused on other things in the environment. Just quickly here, a study that we did several years ago, these are actually identical faces. So the facial information is exactly the same, but the hairstyles trigger different stereotypes and expectations about the people. And so these were old hairstyles. These are from the 90s. So this is like a Hispanic hairstyle. This this African American hairstyle. And we could actually easily get subjects to have different attributions about these people, saying of different intelligences, different motives. People reported that his skin was darker than his skin, even though all the sensory information is the same, but the hairstyle triggered a category membership that let people's stereotypes and expectations flood in and impact what they remember. I'm going to skip to this part here. Why we care about this sort of thing in an eyewitness identification context is that a lineup is supposed to be a test of memory. We're saying, are one of these guys the guy you saw do the crime? It's a classic memory test. Is he here? And so we can look at this real situation here. Two witnesses described the offender as being late teens, 15 to 16. Another person described him as being no more than 18. African American, black, small build, 120 to 140 pounds in weight, 5'2" to 5'5" in height, long hair and some kind of braids, single row braids that were coming loose. And so this is the lineup that was presented. And if we look at, as the upper left being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, how many people think it's number 1? Raise your hand. Number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Most people overwhelmingly choose number 1 because he's the only one that has braids coming loose. Some people that have better perceptual skills with African Americans, which would be in-group African American people, other African American people, can see that this guy has some braids too, so they'll get some choices. But most people choose number 1. And in fact, that is the suspect, that is the one who was suspected and was convicted in an El Paso court and went to prison. None of you saw the crime. You should not be able to pick the perpetrator at any, pick that number 1 guy at any chances greater than, at any greater than chance levels, excuse me. And it's because you didn't see him. You're not matching a memory. But this is a very poor lineup that encourages you to choose one particular person. The problem being is once his face is in your mind, he is the guy. And so later in court, when they say, do you see the person present who loved you, you go him. But you're really working off of this memory, not the memory of the crime situation. I am, due to time, going to skip through a few slides here, a few other examples. Some other issues go with how our expectations impact what we see is that we could say, are these hospital orderly name tag photos, or are these someone that we should be concerned about? And in fact, both of these are people who have been convicted of major felonies and are in Florida federal prison. And so neither of these are like great guys, right? But he has a face that looks like less concerning than this guy. And people will have different sorts of memories and be more sure about him being a not nice guy than they are of him. And we found this also to be the case even with something as simple as people tipping their chin up. That this is the same guy, this was a freshman like many years ago, he probably has like a life and kids and all of that, is that here he was here and here he was here, but when we use this photo in various experiments, they convicted him at greater, they were more likely to convict him, and they convicted him for longer sentences, and they had all sorts of not nice attributions about him compared to him, even though it's the same guy, the same face. So your perceptions are actually pretty sucky, and that's a technical term. It's a pretty sucky form of evidence, and it's because you don't really know anything, sorry to say, and you should always seek confirmatory evidence, and always, very importantly, seek disconfirmatory evidence for the things that you believe. It's really easy to go around in the world and go, see, I'm right, see, I'm right, see, I'm right, but you need to look for the information for the times you might be wrong if you're going to have a nice, good feeling about your belief. I'm going to have to go through some of this quickly. We can and do see things that aren't there. If I allowed you time to look at this, which I will not, because I have 5 minutes left. If we stare at this long enough and then look at this white screen, you're going to actually see the normal American flag. You're going to see the red, white, and blue stripes. I will allow you to stare at this one a little bit. Stare at the 4 dots running down the middle of that part of the image. And when I skip to the next blank slide, I'll just ask that you blink. And if you've kept your focus there, and if I would let you look long enough, you should see something sort of interesting. Experience. Okay? So we do see things that aren't there. Two people can look at the same thing and come to entirely different conclusions. There was black swans. No, it was white swans. It was a vase. No, it was profiles of vases. It was a young woman versus an old woman. Now, us old people usually see the old woman. Does old people see the old woman? All you young people see the, does anybody see the old woman besides me? Did anybody see the young lady? Okay? Does anybody not see one or the other? Who do you not see?
I don't see the old woman.
The old woman is, this whole thing is her face. These are her bangs. This is her eye, and that's the eyelash on her three-quarter profile. This is her big old lady nose. And this is her mouth and her big old lady chin. And this is her, like, fluffy. Okay? It's two entirely different things. Incoming sensory information is not enough because we can see blocks or we can see the word lift. And so when someone says that they see horses, you might want to believe them, let alone if I gave you time to count them. The evil old liberal media might get this photo and say that Dick Cheney's on vacation with a naked woman. We can see her clearly in the reflection. Or is he really just fishing? He's fishing. If you look at this close, this is his fishing rod, and this is his thumb and knuckle. He's fishing. And of course, you can read what's right in front of you. What does this say?
A bird in the bush.
A bird in the bush. But look again. It says a bird in the bush.
Oh!
And you're so good at it, it doesn't even really matter that it's not there at all. You can read this very easily. The cat, red, spot, fish, and debt. But that first one really says, like, to hutch it. Because the H and the A are identical sensory experiences. We can go through the list, but I won't. The brain is continuously working to provide us with information about the environment, and it sometimes gets it wrong. We can look at this as the slinky going, see, it'll switch on you. The slinky going that way, I can put my finger through that way, or the slinky going that way. We can see 3 prongs, or we can see 2. We can see a seat. This is where your butt would go, this is where your back would go, this is where your legs would hang. Or you can flip it, and this is like a chimney coming up, and this is flat. We can see this as a black ceiling. I have to wait for it to happen. A black ceiling with hanging white cubes that have black bottoms that we look up at. Or we can see it as a black floor with white cubes, and the tops of the cubes are black. And this one's the Necker cube. We can see it as a facing square upwards or a facing square downwards, and that one really switches a lot for me. It makes me want to puke. Is it switching for you? And for people who have trouble seeing it, Java is required, so you won't see it. It's just a little animation where the where there is a guy swimming through the cube so that you can see it switch for those of you who have difficulty. We see a flag over a painted mural rock. Okay. Or it's not. It's just a black ribbon that's giving that sense of space. It's difficult to determine size unless we have good information. That's why next time you go to Quick Start Look, there is a height indicator, usually to the right of the doors, so they can tell forwarded around over your email. There's a variety of real and unreal objects in here. That isn't two guys. This guy is real, that beer is real. That guy's not real, that beer is not real. And a variety of other cool examples that I don't have time to show you. Oh, but this is a good one here. Looking at, that's what we see, but that's also what we see. It's the other angle. And I'm going to go right to the last slide, I swear, to not keep our last speaker, our next speaker waiting. So you need to essentially question what you see and question what you think. Seeing isn't always believing. You can see something but make an incorrect inference and then consequently hold an incorrect belief. You can't always believe what you do see or think you see because you can see things that aren't there and then you can miss things that are right in front of your face. And so seeing rightly or wrongly is believing. And so you need to question what you see and question what you believe and continually seek evidence, both confirmatory and disconfirmatory for your beliefs. You may not be able to see this down here, but this is Bill Nye and that guy Ham. What would cause you to change your mind? Ken Ham says nothing. Bill Nye says evidence. Thanks a lot. Sorry for going over time.
All right, unfortunately, we don't have time to ask Dr. Macklin questions, so thank you again for coming. Our next speech is Dr. Roberts, who's starting approximately right now. And then at 7 o'clock tonight, we have Aaron Thomas, who is a magician, doing a show right here. So I will see you all back then.
Probably not.
That's
Dr. Brian Roberts teaches in the UNI History Department. He received his PhD from Rutgers University. He published his first book in 2000, which was titled American Alchemy, the California Gold Rush and Middle Class Culture. Since then, he has published a few articles and is finishing up the second book, an interpretation of popular music called Early America the Musical, Popular Song in 19th Century American Culture. At UNI, he teaches courses in labor history, popular culture, and environmental history. His latest interest in history, for which he has been deemed pretty crazy by a number of students and professors, is to look into expanding the idea of historical agency to include non-human species. Please welcome Dr. Brian Roberts.
Okay. Yeah, I looked at the list of the presentations and I realized mine is probably not going to fit in with the rest of those because I was thinking this would be more of a kind of a chance for me to show up and do one of my rants or whatever, what people think are my rants, what my students think are rants. Anyway, so we start with the high point, in some ways, of American environmentalism, which is the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. Now, there were a lot of individuals behind the making of Earth Day and the kind of rise in popularity in the 60s and 70s of environmentalism. Some of the names are very well known, like John Muir, Ellen Swallow, Benton MacKaye, the guy who kind of gave us the Appalachian Trail, as well as this person, Aldo Leopold, who is a native Iowan and is, who wrote one of the greatest books in kind of environmental thinking, A Sand County Almanac, which was published after his death in 1949. This is really just a kind of a serious almanac. That is, it's a kind of a laying out of the passing of the year in his area in Wisconsin and then what he sees in nature. And he just kind of goes out every day during the different days of the season and looks and sees different animals, sees animals' tracks, sees the leaves falling, sees the buds appearing on trees, this kind of thing. And it's really about kind of reconnecting to the natural environment. And it's a book that really kind of comes out in a period when people are more alienated from nature than ever. And of course, we've gotten more alienated since then. As he says in the book, like winds and sunsets, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them. Now we face the question whether a still higher standard of living is worth its cost in things natural, wild, and free. Another key contributor to Earth Day and the popularity of environmentalism would be, of course, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was, to some degree, a kind of amateur scientist, but she did have training. She didn't have the kind of professional training we would associate with the kind of highest level of science, but she clearly knew her stuff. In Silent Spring, she really made an argument about the effects of DDT on the environment, the pesticide DDT, which she said was going to result in the eradication of many bird species and give us then a silent spring in the future. She said in the book, the road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed. But at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our last, our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. And you get the feeling there she's somewhat hopeful, but not brimming with confidence that things are going to change. This was the book that really contributed or kind of produced a lot of kind of environmental thinking that is very dated now in terms of kind of the way people were thinking at the time. It's Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which came out in 1968. And it had this very famous little statement here on the cover of the book. While you are reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation, most of them children. And I remember as a kid seeing this book lying around, I think, on a kitchen table, and thinking that that was kind of a talismanic device. Every time you read it, you were killing 4 children. And so it was kind of fascinating to me, but it was kind of also scary. Things have moved on since then. The world population in 1968, when this book came out, was about 3.5 billion people. World population today, 7.14 billion people, and climbing very, very fast. If you ever want to freak yourself out, just go to the world population clock and just watch the numbers click by. That's something that makes you feel claustrophobic. At least it does with me. It took all of the beginning of time, from the beginning of time till 1804, for the world's population to reach 1 billion. So all of history and prehistory to 1804. And at the current rate of growth, it takes about 12 years to add 1 billion more people to the planet. So we are well beyond what Ehrlich was talking about in The Population Bomb. But interestingly, population has not become a very popular topic for environmentalists, and I'll get into that later. Out of Earth Day and the popularity of Earth Day, you see this explosion in the popularity of environmentalism. And as well, you see this kind of government reaction. Here you get the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which was established 1970. 1970, you also get environmental legislation, the Clean Air Act. 1972, you get the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which became the Clean Water Act in 1977. This is an act where basically different areas have to try to be in compliance with the Clean Water Act. Iowa does not have a great history of being in compliance with the Clean Water Act. Most of the water in Iowa is not very clean, does not meet federal clean water standards. And here's the environmental legislation, the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This is actually one of the most important acts for environmentalists, because what the act says is that it sets up procedures for the creation of a list of endangered species, both plants and animals. And then it says that once a plant or animal is on the list, the habitat that they were in has to also be protected. So actually the Endangered Species Act became a way for environmentalists to protect land as well as the creatures on it. And here you see the bald eagle, which is one of the great success stories of modern environmentalism. If you went back 20 years ago even in Iowa, and ask about bald eagles, people just hadn't seen them in a long, long time. And now they're actually very common. You see them all the time going up and down the Cedar River. So this is a great success story. I believe this picture of the bald eagle is the one that was killed by lead poisoning at a nearby shooting range. So this is a local bald eagle. And of course, does anyone know what that creature is? That's one of the most famous endangered species. That's the spotted owl, right? And so spotted owl, you hear a lot of people howling about the spotted owl. You reach this high point about the time of the first Earth Day. You see corporations like Coca-Cola actually jumping on the bandwagon, saying this is the bottle for the age of ecology or the drink for environmentalists. You get these environmental groups. Some of these groups had been around a long time. The Appalachian Mountain Club, the National Audubon Society, they kind of shifted their focus right about this time to be much more based in environmentalism. Other groups here had been environmental groups for a while, the Sierra Club, the Wilderness Society. And then what I want you to notice is just how many groups formed right around the period of the late 60s. So you can clearly get this sense that this is when environmentalism was really kind of hitting its stride. So during these kind of heady days of environmentalism, you get these kind of creation of wish lists for these groups. And the wish lists, as you can see here, would be things like increased protection for the environment, water, soil, plants, and animals, government oversight and control of the nation's worst polluters with fines, increased corporate responsibility, basically asking corporations to kind of control themselves, especially for automobiles, which we know has been pretty successful, with smog controls, emission controls, fuel efficiency, and then in oil, asking companies to clean up any oil spills. That one hasn't been quite as successful. Any oil spill now usually ends up, as we know, in a long lawsuit, as the different companies basically say, this is not, we didn't really do it. And number 4 here, more rational approaches to urban planning. That is kind of including public transport, but also, for the most part, what they're talking about there is smart towns. Towns that are based on where people work is much closer to where they live. And so you don't have to have long commutes, as well as bicycle and walking friendly towns. This is one of the areas of environmentalism that has not really caught on. And then reductions in consumption and waste, clearly not something that Americans have been all that on board with. And then population control. So this is a kind of wish list of what environmental groups wanted when things looked really good. A few things got in the way of environmentalism. And here's where kind of environmentalism ran up against what you would call kind of hegemonic ideas. Hegemony here means kind of cultural ideas that are incredibly powerful and really deeply rooted within our culture. One of them is the idea of progress. And this is kind of the background for the idea of progress represented in this slide. Here you have the Great Seal of the United States, which, as you can see, took from 1776 to 1782 to design. So this was not something that they just kind of slapped together really quickly. You know, it's got the other side with the eagle. So it's a little bit more than this. But this was something they took seriously. They had several committees among the founding fathers to come up with a Great Seal. This is the pyramid side of the Great Seal, and it's a statement of providentialism. Christian providentialism, the idea that he, a God, watches over us, the American empire, as we build it. How do we know this is a statement of empire? Pyramids are built by empires. Pyramids are also built by slaves. This one is an unfinished pyramid, which of course the idea is it has 13 tiers representing the original 13 states, and the nation will continuously add to this pyramid. And above it all, we see the eye of an imagined God watching over this kind of empire. Providentialism would be the kind of foundational idea for progress, what we call progress. And progress is kind of, I would say, and many others would say among historians, it's America's dominant bias. It is what you as a student learn in terms of American history. American history unfolds as a progressive narrative, which means over time, things always get better. So you start out with a kind of dark history. Here, you clearly see progress kind of moving across the nation in John Gass' painting American Progress. You have the kind of past here represented by miners, but also Native Americans here, kind of like cockroaches scuttling into the darkness. Here you have this luminous giant woman representing progress, wearing a toga, clearly a reference to empire again. And then you have the kind of coming of light, but also the train, the telegraph, etc. So here you have this kind of encoding of American progress. We all believe that history moves in the direction of improvement and progress. Another very strong belief, deeply, deeply rooted, is Christian dominionism. And of course, this comes from the Bible. In Genesis, it's really right toward the front of the Bible. Chapter 1, verse 26, and I think it goes into the next two verses. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And from there it goes into being plentiful and multiplying, and a restatement of having dominion over the earth. For me, this is really the crux of the Bible and the crux of Christian belief, is dominionism. Everything else goes from this. This is really the statement that we are going to do pretty much whatever we want to the earth and have sanction to do it. Dominionism would end up becoming humanism. And the idea here is that we study humans, we study their contribution to the world at the exclusion of pretty much every other species. And the reason that humans are in this position where they are superior to all other species on the planet is because this idea that God created them. They are made in God's image, and so they have within them the spark of divinity. Humans have a spark of divinity. And so we study Shakespeare's works. We study the Mona Lisa. As historians, we study the record of humanity on the planet and the experience of humans on the planet. Now, the popular forms of environmentalism that we have are very much framed by Christian dominionism and ideologies of progress. Here's one. This one actually comes from academics to a large extent. This one is, nature is a human construct, which for kind of average people, they don't really banty about the term construct or human construct that often, but they think in approximately this way. And part of this is kind of trickled down from academics where people like William Cronin, who is the nation's top environmental historian, have said that we really can't just think of nature as the wilderness or as some place that's kind of wild and pure and undeveloped in terms of nature. We need to think of nature as everything. And so I get a lot of students kind of come into class the first day and always kind of have that kind of gotcha statement. You know, nature is everything. We need to look at nature this way. And so here's my backyard. This is my old backyard back when I lived in Vegas. Actually, I never lived in Vegas. I just thought it looked good to say that. But this would have been my backyard if I did live in Vegas, and that's nature. Since nature is a construct, I can find nature in my backyard. And so if I'm in my backyard, I can kind of enjoy the nature of the trees, this kind of thing. The idea of nature as a human construct, we construct an idea of nature as kind of pure, but we can also just kind of make nature out of anything in our own mind. We can find things in nature there. You can find birds in this kind of backyard. Anyone know what kind of bird you would find? What's the backyard bird in cities in America? Yeah, it's a house sparrow is probably the most common one, which is actually an English bird that was brought over here and has thrived in degraded human environments, it turns out. They actually do really well in urban environments. Now, that's really nature. It's true. Number 5 in the 6 popular forms of environmentalism is the save the blank, some creature. 3 creatures you can hear about saving would be the polar bears. This is interesting because these polar bears are turning this back on us and saying they want to save the humans too. And this one here is going kind of turning into a human slightly, or may have just lost the fur off his claw there. You can also save the bald eagle, and then of course the whales. What a lot of the animals that we kind of get on board with for kind of this popular idea of saving animals, a lot of them have in common is they've never been eaten. There's never been a history of eating any of these animals. The whale is actually the closest thing to have ever become an object that Americans have eaten. And there was a big movement around the time of World War II to actually introduce whale meat to the American public. And supposedly it's pretty good, but Americans never got on board with the idea of eating whales. And so none of these things are eaten by us. And it turns out we're not as good at saving any animals that we eat. If we eat them, they may be gone. Number 4 in the 6 popular forms of environmentalism would be consumer environmentalism, or what we call greenwashing, where you just simply take a product and surround it with the rhetoric of environmentalism. With BP, they've actually gone away from this recently, but up until the time of their great big Gulf oil spill, they were marketing themselves as the green oil company. And of course, if you want to kind of think about alternative energy, BP was asking you to think about oil. And then Toyota, which is here advertising the RAV4 diesel as the car that nature wants to own. And there's some bunny rabbits trying to break into the RAV4. Number 3, freedom. This is not all that environmental in terms of kind of saving the environment. So really what you end up with is kind of 2 concepts of nature, 2 very popular concepts of nature that develop in the 19th century. This is in addition to an older concept that sees nature as a lot of resources. The 2 concepts that compete in the 19th century are, one is this kind of John Muir concept of nature as a temple. a place where you go to contemplate beauty, and you just kind of sit there and look at the trees, look at the wind blowing through the trees, and you contemplate the animals. And this is not a very destructive relationship with nature. The other concept of nature is the frontier, that it's a place where you go to get away from things that bother you. You go out there and you enjoy your freedom. Most of the people that you're going to meet, people don't go out in nature that much anymore, but if you do go out in nature, most of the people you're going to meet are out there to enjoy their freedoms. They are freedom lovers. Number 2 on the list of popular forms of environmentalism would be save it to kill it. And this here is the famous duck stamp issued every year by the U.S. Department of the Interior. For $15, you then buy the stamp, which allows you to get into certain conserved areas, and then you can shoot ducks once you get in there. Then this guy is a Maine hunter who entered the lottery. In Maine, they run a lottery for moose hunting. A lot of people pay money to enter the lottery, and then they choose the people who get to go out and hunt a moose. Now, hunting a moose is not as tough as you might think it is. It's essentially like hunting cows. If you were to do such a thing, you just kind of go out there and find some moose. They just stand there, they look at you, you aim, and you blast them. And so this guy engaged in this heroic activity of hunting down that moose and killing it. And then finally, number 1, save it for our children and our children's children. Here you have a quote from Obama on climate change, where we need to save the planet for future generations, and if we don't, we will betray our children. Climate change is very popular in this kind of, with this kind of idea, saving the planet for the children. Another one that's very popular is this idea of secondhand smoke. As you know, you and I banned smoking anywhere on campus years ago. Interestingly, my students have heard me go off on this one before many times. Interestingly, at the same time, you and I did not ban cars from the campus. And I know we have our parking lots, right, where cars are going to be, but we also have internal roadways where cars are driving all the time. Now, I would put it to you that you're in a lot more danger from getting run over by one of those cars, especially on these cold days where you're wearing these parkas and you can't see out the side, and these cars are going along not paying much attention. You're in real danger. And I feel like I'm in danger all the time from cars. I also would like to say that, again, you guys have heard this. You put a baby in a garage with 10 smokers, close the garage door, come back a half hour later, you've got a smoky baby. It's okay, though, right? It's a little smoky, but it's okay. You take that same baby, put it in the garage with one car, close the garage door. These popular forms of environmentalism, and I'm not going to flog this, but I would say you may notice that they tend to be framed by these ideologies of humanism, Christian dominionism, or progress, Christian providentialism. So these ideas have played a major role in shaping environmentalism. And one thing I'd like to say is we're here to kind of talk about skepticism. And one thing I want to kind of point out here is it's possible that some people who may say, well, I'm not sure about Christianity, I might be closer to atheism, they may be closer to Christianity than they think. If they think in terms of progress, and if they think in terms of humanism, and kind of the humans being kind of what the measure for reality, they may be closer than they think to Christianity. So my question is kind of why have some forms of environmentalism gained traction while other forms have not? This one obviously has gained traction. These guys going out here to get in touch with their freedom. And then I know it's popular for students now to kind of be edgy and, you know, get tattoos and this kind of thing. But if you really want to be edgy, join PETA. No one will like you. You're so edgy that you're just kind of off the chart edgy. Not so much traction. Why is this? First of all, there is a kind of backlash to environmentalism. A neoliberal backlash, which we see very strongly from 1980 to the present in institutions like the National Chamber of Commerce. Chamber of Commerce had been around since 1912, but after 1980, a lot of its talking points became what kind of passed for common sense. And this is very weird to talk about this because I think a lot of your professors don't know that most of you now have no clue what life is like outside of neoliberal America. No clue, right? You're all born after, well after 1980. So you grew up in a whole new world. What are the talking points for the National Chamber of Commerce that have since become kind of hegemonic common sense? First of all, unions are bad. We know that. They're corrupt. They don't work. Second, jobs are good. All jobs are good. There's no such thing as a bad job. Continuous growth is also necessary in economics for us to do well. Now, this actually came about, this belief that in continuous growth was connected very much with the idea of a 501k as your retirement. Everybody starts kind of getting involved in the stock market, and what you get is a kind of financialization of America. We are stuck in a system of continuous growth. And if it doesn't grow all the time, it falls apart. The economy falls apart. Third, communism, as we know, is bad. And communism has actually now become private industry, private enterprise is always efficient and always pure good. We just kind of ignore the fact that when you go into inner cities and places, they've built all these buildings. You know, the